Hello and welcome to this special episode of Freed Indeed Live. I'm your host, Kevin Hughes, and I'm joined here with Loryn Jenkins, and we have a really interesting show tonight. The much anticipated How to Discuss Tradition with Adventists episode. And, like I kind of alluded to a couple of weeks ago, I think sometimes people may find that idea a little bit intimidating because, that word tradition kind of sets off some alarm bells in Adventists, and we'll talk a little bit about why that is today, um, and kind of how you can broach the subject of tradition and how we can um, get into that. So, Loryn, um, how how do we explain tradition to Adventists? I guess
So,
the first thing maybe would be um, maybe even just why would we talk to Adventists about tradition? Like it may seem like an odd thing to even bring up. So why?
yeah, no, thanks for that, Kevin. It's a really good question. Um, I think, first of all, is because Adventist pastors are just now beginning to realize that they need to begin describing and talking about the Adventist tradition. I've just read a book by Pastor Jack Hone called
Mm,
Adventist Tomorrow. And in Adventist Tomorrow, Pastor Jack Hone reevaluates and thinks about a whole range of Adventist beliefs and doctrines and rethinks it and re-relates it to the current day. And within this book, he had to over and over again talk about tradition.
hmm.
Now, however, every single time he talked about tradition and Adventist tradition, it was in a negative and pejorative sense.
Really?
Yes. Every single time he uses tradition to describe something within Adventism, he's assigning it a negative role, that it's a bad thing. That only bad things does he associate with tradition within Adventism. Now, as I've been preparing to teach my catechism course within the Orthodox baptismal class that I teach, I've learned that tradition can be a very good thing,
Right.
and that there's a positive role for tradition within Orthodoxy, and so too there is definitely a positive role for tradition within Adventism, and beyond that. I think the reason why Pastor Jack Hone is reaching for the idea of tradition within Adventism is it turns out, surprisingly, that it's a necessary idea because it's a necessary process.
Right.
And I think we'll get into that a bit later, but we've got to lay some groundwork first. But so that's the crux. We're starting to talk about tradition with Adventists because Adventists are beginning to talk about it, and because it's necessary, and because some of what Adventists say about it is unduly negative, and so
Hmm.
that needs to be balanced.
So within Adventism, they're even being negative about their own tradition.
Correct.
That's
So
fascinating.
yeah, so with respect to Pastor Jack Hone, um, everything he wanted to reject or things he wanted to change about Adventism or things he wanted Adventists to stop doing or to start doing, was assigned this negative thing of, we just do this because of tradition. And I think there needs to be a broader perspective of what tradition is.
So maybe to lay a foundation for that, how would you kind of explain just broadly what tradition is to an Adventist? Because, you know, in my experience when I was an Adventist, the word tradition itself is like almost a dirty word within Adventism. I remember when I was in the Adventist university, um, I was shocked when in one of my classes they discussed the quote unquote Adventist tradition as a description of Adventism, and that was actually the first time I had ever heard an Adventist use the word tradition in a neutral light at all. Up until that point, I had only ever heard Adventists use the word tradition as sort of a pejorative, like, oh, we have the Bible, they have man's traditions, or we go to church on Saturday because of whatever Bible verse, and they only have their tradition. So it's like truth versus tradition, this versus tradition. And there was always kind of this very negative, um, almost like a cloud of negativity around that word itself. So how would you even go about laying the groundwork for just the idea that tradition, before we talk about tradition being something that can be good, what even is kind of tradition such that it can even just be neutral?
Look, I'm fascinated by the fact that within, seminary, that the Adventist pastoral education acknowledges the role of tradition in its neutral sense.
Mm,
As to what you've just said, like you, um, I've always heard Adventist pastors present something as truth, accept the truth, and to accept the truth, you have to abandon the tradition in which you're raised. And it's always truth versus tradition. And that was most prominent to me, I think, in about 2010. There was an evangelistic campaign doing a Daniel and Revelation seminar. This very charismatic speaker stood up there and presented for 3 hours each night for 13 or 14 nights. And on one of the last nights of this series, he presented the Sabbath truth, and he invited people to accept the Sabbath truth in opposition to the tradition that they had been
mm.
raised in. And that strong sense of truth versus tradition that you've pointed to has been true of my experience too. And I think that if anyone is going to engage an Adventist in a discussion about tradition, needs to first of all begin by acknowledging that Adventism has traditionally has traditionally opposed truth and tradition, and has said that truth is something that needs to be accepted in contradistinction to tradition. So, one of just to unpack this Adventist mindset, my mindset, go back another 10 years, around the year 2000. I was in Atlanta, Georgia, and we were. I was within an Adventist church plant, and we were preparing to go to a sort of an ecumenical church planting conference in Chicago. And we were in discussion with some of the organisers, and they were preparing us for how to go, and we were having discussions with them. And they turned to us and said that, oh yeah, it's so great to have people from a Sabbath keeping tradition attending our conference. And when I heard that, it felt like I'd slammed into a brick wall. It really was like someone hit me in the nose sort of thing, because my immediate thought was, we don't keep Sabbath out of a tradition. We keep Sabbath because it's the truth, or because God commanded it. It's not a traditional teaching. It is a commandment that we are observing. And so to hear someone say that something that we do is traditional was a big shock to me. And it's something I denied. And
Hmm.
I would flat out deny it. So I'm just a little bit curious as to how you process that, hearing it in a neutral sense in seminary.
Well, like I said, I was really shocked, and I actually sent an email to my professor. And looking back on it, it's kind of funny because in my email, I'm going, I kind of said, like, I take exception to the idea that you're saying Adventist tradition, and you know tradition is bad. Like, we shouldn't have a tradition. We shouldn't have any traditions. And his response via email was kind of something to the effect of, um everybody has traditions. And it was kind of, this was a mind-blowing concept to me at the time, that tradition could even, that the word tradition could have a sense that wasn't negative.
And that
um
was from a faithful Adventist seminarian, right?
Yeah, this is from a professor who's been in Adventist all his life, has been teaching Adventist seminary for probably 20 years, has been leading prophecy seminars probably for as long or longer. A true blue Adventist scholar, and here he is telling me that it's okay to have a tradition, that it's okay to talk about Adventist tradition, and that's not necessarily a bad thing. And he even threw some examples at me of things that he knew were part of my sort of cultural context as an Adventist, that w- couldn't be described as anything but traditions.
All right. So how about we just start enumerating some of those? I'd like to pose the first one. Do
Sure.
you share the tradition of haystacks?
Yes, indeed. Haystack. My uh, when my wife and I were first, I can't remember if we were married yet or if we were still engaged, but we visited an Adventist church together, and there was actually a discussion that broke out about haystacks, because they made haystacks, and Cheryl shared her theory that haystacks should be considered its own category of food, because it's not really a salad, but it's not really nachos. And she shared this kind of half joking, because somebody had said haystacks are like nacho salad, and she said, well, it's kind of its own thing. And it was hilarious because the person's response was just so, um just so dejected, like that haystacks wasn't nacho salad was so dejecting for this person. But and that just kind of cracks me up. But yeah, haystacks is like a huge thing, huge tradition in Adventism.
Right, and as far as I know, as far as I can tell, it appears to be a global tradition within
Hmm.
Adventism. Now, I grew up in Australia, and the first 25 years of my life, we'd have haystacks when we have potluck lunches. That was a common thing, and it's something I really loved, and I still love it. And we still have it. I
Right.
still have haystacks on a weekly basis. Okay, and
Really?
that is part of my Adventist heritage that I live out today still. My wife and I eat haystacks frequently.
That is
But
so cool.
when I was 26 years old, we moved to Atlanta, Georgia, and I discovered that Adventists there in Georgia uh, eat haystacks. And then later on, thanks to the power of Facebook and being able to compare things on a global basis, I've found out that haystacks are also eaten in Adventist circles in Europe and in Africa. And as far as I'm aware, this is a global food tradition within Adventism.
That's so fascinating because I don't even think of some of the components of haystacks as being overly common. And how many Europeans are eating corn chips outside of haystack? That's so fascinating. But I believe it. It's a global Adventist tradition.
And it's provided it's eaten in moderation with everything else, it's an entirely good tradition.
Right.
And every time Tammy and I make haystacks for people who have never even heard of Adventists, they come to our home and we prepare them a haystack meal and say, this is what we have frequently. The comments is inevitably positive.
Right.
Yeah,
I
it's a
believe it.
really good thing, and that's traditional. And now, if we're thinking about the haystacks, of course, there's two parts of it. There is the part of receiving and learning
Hmm.
about haystacks and how to make it and how to actually add it to your plate. That other people made that dish and prepared it and modeled how to prepare it, and we received the modeling. So they did it, and we took it on and copied them. That's a tradition being passed down. That's a tradition being, in actual fact, the word tradition in the Bible actually means to pass down, and so it's actually a verb. It's actually to hand
Oh,
off, to pass
interesting.
down. And so, really, when we're reading tradition in the Bible, it's really traditioning.
Right.
If something is traditioned, it's passed down. And so, haystacks was passed down to me from the broader Adventist culture. And then the second part of the tradition is the content of the tradition, is the actual foodstuffs in this case. The actual content of the tradition was taken on and learned. And once you master the art of haystacks, you can substitute different things in. Uh,
Right.
there is the common ingredients of everything you expect to be on the haystacks, but you can decorate it with different things and you can add different things in. And you can get innovative around it. It's not completely fixed. It's not completely canon. You know,
Right.
you know what the canon haystack is. You know what the prototypical haystack is. But you can sometimes decorate it with other stuff.
Right. You can use guacamole chips and Doritos and
I know. I mean, spring onion. Do you often use spring onion on your on your?
Oh, actually, Cheryl made it with spring onion one time. That was pretty good. That was pretty
Yeah, it
good.
is. Yeah, yeah, indeed, indeed. But hey, there are other traditions within Seventh-Day Adventism. Think about Sabbath school. Think about
Yeah,
Sabbath school.
Sabbath school.
Yeah, yeah. So, what's your experience with Sabbath school then as a tradition?
You know, well, Sabbath school is another basically universal tradition within Adventism. Every Adventist church I've ever been to has a Sabbath school. It's kind of very much, uh, I think when you're in Adventism, there's almost an impression you would get that this is how people were taught back in like the synagogues in ancient Judaism, like that but even if that were the case, that would still be a tradition handed down through the ages of people. But yeah, it's like you show up, there's maybe a Bible verse or maybe a Sabbath school lesson from the conference or whatever, and you open it up, everybody has their thing, and maybe the teacher will ask a question and people come up with a Bible verse to respond to their question or that sort of thing. It sort of it even has a traditional format.
Mm. Oh, yeah. Tell me about the traditional format. I was the Sabbath school superintendent for a year or two at Windsor SDA Church in New South Wales. And I wanted to see whether the format that we were using was the optimum format or whether we might want to change it up to
Uh-oh.
just spruik things up a little bit. So I conducted a survey. I conducted this fancy survey where everyone filled things out and how much time do you want to dedicate to worship? How much time do you want to dedicate to study? How much time do you want to dedicate to the singing and the prayers and the mission story and so forth and so on? And I got all my responses back and I compiled this statistical analysis and broke it down and got the synthesis of everyone's points of view. And the end result was do exactly what we've been doing.
It's a tradition. Don't mess with the tradition.
Everyone wanted to keep doing exactly what we've been doing.
Wow. Oh, I think we lost your sound for a second there. Yeah, but it is interesting that you mentioned that, and I've I thought about this too. That it's interesting that Sabbath school is almost like a miniature um, Adventist church service before the church service. I still can't hear you. Let's see what's going on with your mic here. There we go. Now I hear you.
Sorry, I was using too much hand waving and I managed to completely swipe my mic.
Oh no. You got excited about the about the tradition there.
I did. I got very. I wanted to be an innovator and to help move us forward. I learned that traditions can be quite conservative. That once you get
Right.
used to something being the way it is, you don't want it to change, and no one wants it to change. Everyone wants
Right.
it to keep going. It's got a life of its own. And it's really got a life of its own that outlives the individual. It's the conservative power of tradition is quite strong.
That's very interesting, and thinking about that um thinking about that from an Orthodox perspective, I think about the traditions within Orthodoxy that you know we believe come from the apostles, and how these traditions, it's like these are ways that the apostolic teaching itself has been preserved. And some of these are things that are very simple, like the fact that churches are usually built in such a way that they face towards the east, um, because traditionally paradise is seen as being in the east. You know, the Garden of Eden was planted in the east. It doesn't say east of what, so we just put everything oriented towards the east as part of that tradition of we're looking to paradise. But meanwhile, the gospel reading is traditionally read towards the north because the man of the north is the enemy of God. And when we read the gospel, we're essentially reading the condemnation of the enemies of God. So we read it towards the north. And these are just, these are just very small things, but it's like there's all a power, a sort of teaching that's preserved in that. And you can see that, but you can see the same positive thing there in Adventism as well. Again, we're not being negative. This is a positive thing within Adventism, that you have this tradition of Sabbath school that gets carried on and is preserved in such a way that it preserves something special and good for people, such that they don't want it to change. When the topic of possibly changing it comes up, it's like, no, keep it exactly as it is. This is what's right. And
Indeed. And now you're surmising that uh, that Sabbath school might have been almost like the way the synagogues were run in the first century. Um, I know you didn't mean that literally, but there might be an actual deeper sense in which that actually might be true. But I think that's time for another conversation. Perhaps we'll bookmark that. But some good friends of mine, and probably some good friends of yours, have been doing a series, a YouTube series on the history of the Sabbath,
oh,
and one of their series focuses on the history of the synagogue and exactly what happened at the synagogue. So I think after we've done this, we'll probably add this to to either the show notes or in the Facebook chat, and give a link to their thing, because at the end they actually show a whole range of Jewish scholarship as to what the synagogue was actually like in the first century, and it might actually be a little bit closer to Sabbath school than what we even imagined.
oh, that's interesting. That is
Um,
really interesting.
but having said that, the actual tradition of Sabbath school actually derived from the 19th century. As far as I can
Oh,
tell
really?
in my history, there was a move to bring about Sunday school within the broader, evangelical / Puritan tradition, and the purpose was to, educate people about what's in the Bible, for a populace that was generally, in compared to today's terms, uneducated. So this
Right.
this was an essential form of education and the transmission of Puritan culture.
Of their
And
tradition.
yeah, and Adventists borrowed that and took
Oh,
that on, and so it's come out of that mid 19th century, broader evangelical / Puritan
huh.
model.
That is
Um,
really fascinating. I do have to ask, just maybe briefly, but when you mentioned about those guys doing the thing about the synagogue service, it made me wonder, do they happen to talk about the zodiac and how, cuz that was actually a huge, I just recently learned that the zodiac was actually a huge thing in the synagogues. And we didn't real we modern people didn't realize how big of a thing it was until a whole bunch of excavations were done. And in all of these excavations of actual ancient synagogues, the 12 zodiac signs were very prominently displayed in these synagogues, and it actually kind of freaked people out for freaked evangelicals and stuff out. Of course, Jews, they, because of their tradition, they knew, they were like, oh yeah, we were doing this. But did these guys mention like how the zodiac factored into their to the synagogue worship and stuff?
Not that I recall, in fact, but maybe I'll give you a link. You can go and have a look and see whether it did come up. It's not something that registered on my consciousness when I was watching the show.
No problem. I just when you mentioned that, I kind of thought about that. Oh, that's interesting. I wonder if they. Anyway, I didn't mean to derail you there,
That's all right.
yeah, that's
Hey,
a
I'm just thinking about it a little bit more. Just another, example. Communion 4 times a year.
right.
Communion once a
That is
quarter.
interesting.
Once a quarter. Once a quarter, 4 times a year. Think about that. I mean, in the Bible, Jesus doesn't actually give any
Right.
time frame or any periodicity for communion at all. No periodicity for communion.
Right.
The only thing Jesus says is as often as you do this, without stipulating how often that is.
Right.
Now, you and I worship now in the Orthodox tradition.
Right.
We participate in communion on a weekly basis.
Right. At least
We
weekly.
participate in communion every single week. I have come across some Christian traditions that celebrate communion once a year at Easter.
Yeah. Like the what are they? The Scottish Reformed, I think it is. Do
Okay.
that. And
Mm.
it's like a big party for their communion is a big party, and people come from all over to partake. It's kind of interesting.
Right. Oh, but I should ask you, seeing you're seeing you're communing in the Russian uh, jurisdiction,
Yes.
what is the tone or the tenor of your Pascha uh, service?
Oh, well, actually, it's in a lot of ways, like um, it's almost like a military victory. Actually, like it's kind of how I would imagine if maybe you were in an army that just conquered like a territory and you've just won like a major battle. That's kind of all of the hymnography that we have for Pascha is like that. It's like very much like almost these military hymns of triumph, like trampling down death by death, and on those in the graves bestowing life. And
Do you guys
um
do a good solid stomp when you trample
yes.
death by death? Yeah.
Yeah, we actually do they do a procession around, and we actually follow the procession stomping out that trampling down death by death. And it's like and we do, you know, and our priest really loves to do this, but the pounding on the door. And he he said that one time he actually did it so hard that I guess he broke something on the other side.
Uh,
So,
I'm going
uh,
to say to all our listeners out there, if you haven't ever, witnessed an Orthodox Pascha, you owe it to yourself to find your local Orthodox church somewhere, and in Holy Week, start turning up around about Wednesday and go through a Wednesday night service, a Thursday night service, the Friday night service, and it goes from it's like it's the lighting is dark.
mhm,
There's candles. everything's in the minor key, and it goes from mournful on Wednesday to really dirge-like on Friday. And then when you get to this, Christ is risen moment on the Saturday night moving into Sunday morning, there is just the floodlight opens up, and it switches from dirgeful and mournful songs to absolute joy bursting forth. And it's something that really powerfully impacted me the first time I experienced it. And
Me
if
as
you
well.
haven't, you've just got to. It's an amazing worship experience there. Hey, but Kevin, we've just been talking about some traditions within Adventism that are good and proper traditions, that are not we're not saying that these things are bad. We're saying that these things are good, that there's a conservative element, that there's a teaching element, there's a enculturation element and passing along of how to worship and who to worship within Adventism. As an Adventist, though, I had no idea that tradition was something that the Bible recommended.
Mm-hmm.
Would you like to, share this link? I don't know whether you can get it on screen or something, but
I believe we can.
Awesome. So if you do, I'd just like to walk through with you through some of these Bible verses, because somehow, as an Adventist, I definitely read my Bible multiple times, all the way through, every word, but somehow these verses didn't register with me. Perhaps you'd like to read through the first 3 or 4, and let's
Sure.
comment on what's needs to be commented on, eh?
Sure. So the first one we have here is 2 Thessalonians 2:15, which says, "So then, brothers, stand firm and hold to the traditions that you were taught by us, either by spoken word or by letter."
So the letter is what he's writing to the Thessalonians, right? This is his letter. So that's written, but he's also delivering spoken instructions.
Right. And
you go
Father
on.
Father Josiah Trenum, he talks about this verse, and he mentions that, and he says, it's interesting that certain traditions that are opposed to tradition, we might say, they will try to say that this verse is really just using the word tradition, but it actually just means the scriptures themselves. But the problem is that, when Paul writes this to the Thessalonians, he's saying that there were things he taught them in person that were not taught in his letters. And, if we kind of take the position logically, it just makes sense that, if after Paul died, it's not like the Thessalonians are now going to say, okay, Paul lived among us and taught us for all these years, but now all of that is gone. It doesn't matter anymore. And all that matters is these 2 letters he wrote us. Like, that just doesn't make sense, right?
No, it just wouldn't happen. You wouldn't just throw away years of living experience, and just said we're only going to take what he actually wrote to us, because some of the things that Paul modelled is just like the haystacks thing, right? Paul modelled how to baptize people. Paul modelled how to do, certain ritual washings and certain other things. We know this because he says it in Hebrews chapter 6, that there was ritual washings that was part of his religion, that he instructed and taught people on what to do. He didn't write about that other than in passing, but he taught and instructed the people who were working directly with him, people like Timothy, on how to properly practice this faith.
Right, exactly. Um so the next one there is 1 Corinthians 11:1 and 2, and that one says, "Be imitators of me as I am of Christ. Now I commend you because you remember me in everything and maintain the traditions even as I have delivered them to you."
Mm. Now, this is a really important thing because, there's elsewhere that Paul says that he received the gospel directly from Christ himself, not
Mhm.
from the apostles. And then Paul went out and spent, 16 years in Arabia, and came back and then spent a whole bunch of time in the church of Antioch, worshipping and learning within Antioch. And so when he went out, he was delivering, yes, a gospel that was delivered to him by Jesus Christ independently of the other apostles, but he was also taking the church life that he experienced at Antioch and the traditions that flowed from that. And some of these traditions involved hymns, other of the traditions involved prayers. The traditions, of course, there was plenty of traditions around the story of Jesus and who Jesus was and what he did and what um, what doctrines he taught, what parables he taught, his teachings, but also, the use of the Psalms within
Mhm.
worship. All those sorts of things were part of the traditions that he's talking about here.
Right. Like so when he talks about imitating him as he imitates Christ, you can't do that just by reading something that he wrote. You would have to do that based upon experiences that you had of him, right?
Yeah, absolutely. In certainly, with respect to the people he's writing to who have experienced him, and then we have to understand, because Scripture can't be broken, that they did imitate him as he imitated Christ, so that the following generation who didn't come into direct contact with Paul came into contact with the people who had come into contact with Paul and modeled his life as Paul modeled Christ's life. And that's how the life of the Spirit of God has been passed down in the church through generations.
Right. So that was kind of what I was thinking, was that you know this is why it's so important and so essential to study, for example, church history. It's not just that these are some interesting facts, it's that within this we can actually see this this lineup, if you will, of how we're imitating Christ and his apostles and carrying on the traditions that they've handed down. So, just like in Adventism, you have this carrying on of traditions like Sabbath school from the 19th century and haystacks, and these are good traditions that it's good that people carry them on. Likewise, the church has always had these good traditions, and it's good that people carry them on because they're being imitators of the apostles as they imitate Christ. Do you think that's a helpful way of kind of understanding that?
Yeah, I do. I do. So perhaps let's just finish off um, with Colossians 2:8.
Sure. See to it that no one takes you captive by philosophy and empty deceit, according to human tradition, according to the elemental spirits of the world, and not according to Christ.
So with this one, I think this acknowledges the fact that there are traditions that are opposed to the tradition of the church. There are
Hmm.
traditions that are opposed to the traditions that have flowed from the apostles and taught by Christ that are not rooted and founded in Him. And so traditions, to say that something is traditional, it's important to say which tradition you're drawing it from.
Hmm.
Um, and to be Christian, it's important that a tradition be drawn from Christ and his apostles. Um, and this is the teaching of the Bible. Now, Adventists attend quite readily to, Mark chapter 7, where Jesus talks about the traditions of men being opposed to the word of God. But
Right.
that's not the only type of tradition that's discussed in the Bible. The Bible later on, as we've just read in Colossians 2:8, does talk about traditions that are philosophical in nature or that derive from demonic elements of the world.
Mm.
And these things need to be rejected. But the tradition that comes from Christ and taught by his apostles are good. And so
Right.
the teaching of the Bible needs to be balanced. And we need to have a balanced view as to the teaching of the Bible. The Bible says that tradition is very important. Within Christianity, the Christian tradition is important, and that there are traditions that are opposed to the Christian tradition. This is the teaching of the Bible.
Right. So, you know, as we think about that, we do have a question from a viewer here, and I think that maybe what you just said might actually answer their question. So I'm going to plaster that question up here, and it says, how does one deal with losing their religion? I'm assuming he means losing his faith by attending church regularly. And that's Kyle uh, Vintech. Vinteth. Sorry if I'm mispronouncing your name, Kyle. But we have Kyle here. He says, how does one deal with losing their religion by attending church regularly? Well, it sounds to me, if I may, it sounds to me like what you just said actually answers that, um, because generally what I think happens with situations like Kyle, I know Kyle was um, kind of participating in the book club we had earlier this week as well. And some of the things Kyle experienced that turned him off in his context are things that are exactly what you were just talking about, traditions that are actually not Christian traditions. They're opposed to Christian tradition. So there can be individual people, families, even whole cultures sometimes can have traditions that are actually bad and harmful, and those traditions are opposed to Christ. And so those are things that the Bible talks about us being against, and those are actually things that the church's tradition um, goes against as well. So when you find these very negative, very unfortunate traditions, you'll actually find that they go against the traditions of the church itself when you study when you study actual church. So Lauren, did you have something to add to that?
Look, I'm really glad you knew the pastoral background to that question. What I was going to say was I need some more information to understand what you're talking about, but clearly you've interacted with Kyle before and understand where he's coming from. So I reckon that's great.
Awesome. Yeah, I don't know all of Kyle's story, but just some of the things he shared earlier in the week. It sounds like he had some very negative experiences with some folks who were very much living outside of the Christian tradition, but still for some reason doing something that I don't totally understand, which I've seen at times, which is naming the name of Christ, but then not wanting any part in what Christ actually teaches. So that's always a little confusing to me when I see people doing that, where they say that they want to be Christians, but then they don't seem to actually believe or practice anything that Christianity teaches. It's a little odd, but unfortunately that has clearly had a negative effect on poor Kyle. So definitely something there, but I think that like like you had said, sometimes we can have and whole cultures can have these really bad traditions, and it's it's unfortunate, but the answer to that is to find redemption in the church. And then what happens when the church has, like, in Russia for example, it's not like every tradition in Russia is a good tradition, but what you find is that as the church has had 1,000 years of practice in Russia, the church has sort of redeemed the culture, and the culture has been built more around the church, so that the church's traditions become dominant in a region, in a land. And obviously not everything that happens in Russia is good, but I just use that as an example. May the Lord grant that the United States and Australia would have that same reality, where the church would have the ability to make our cultures, not that we would cease to have our culture, Australia would still be Australia, the US would still be the US, but that these things would find their, like you talked about 2 weeks ago, find their fullness in the church, that the church would give sort of new life and breath to these things.
Hey,
But I don't.
thanks, Kyle, for your question. I hope we've hit the nail on the head for you. But if we haven't, feel free to send us a follow-up question, or maybe engage us in on the Facebook group, and we can
Yeah,
talk,
absolutely.
discuss things a little bit more pertinently if you need to provide us some more information.
Absolutely.
Hey, so we've been talking about um, some traditions within Seventh-Day Adventism. Um, but some of the things we've been mentioning, um, you know, might be seen as quite incidental.
Right.
Um, and we did that purposely to talk about some incidental things. But we can analyze things a little bit at a little bit deeper level too. Um, so just thinking about communion 4 times a year, I just thought I'd throw this in there that I just happened to find out the probable source of the 4 times a year.
Oh, really?
Yeah,
Do
so it
share.
goes it goes like this. Adventism got its 4 times a year communion from the Puritan culture that it was surrounded in northeastern United States, and the Puritan culture got their 4 times a year communion from the Church of England. So when the
Oh,
Puritans broke away from the Church of England, it was at the time common to have 4 communions a year within the Church of England. And that's been passed down for about 400 odd years.
interesting. But
Now,
now,
it was later on in the 19th century when the Church of England had it had an awakening, it had a spiritual enlivening process in which communion once a week was championed. And it was from the mid-19th century that the Church of England began to again practice communion on a weekly basis.
Hmm.
So that's why we see the Church of England, Anglicans, the Anglican Communion, continuing Anglican Communion, and so forth, practicing communion on a weekly basis, along with Roman Catholics and Orthodox communions practicing them once a week.
Right.
But the whole Puritan culture just happened to be what was happening in the Church of England at the time when they broke off. And, Adventists to this day will justify it as being the right thing to do because, and they've got reasons, because they'll say, if you do it every single week, it becomes routine and it's not special. And if you do it too infrequently, you lose the, spiritual effect of it. So 4 times a year is the perfect number of times, sort of thing.
Right. Which
Which
they're not getting from the Bible.
it's not from the Bible. It is. So here's something important to say. Have you heard, as an Adventist, I guess you've heard this, we have no creed but the Bible.
Yes, I definitely
It
heard
is
that
our
very
only
often.
rule of faith and practice.
Yes, I heard that very often.
With respect to communion 4 times a year, it is not the only rule of faith and practice.
Right.
There is a tradition governing the frequency that is outside of the Bible. Now, it's not necessarily opposed to the Bible, but it's outside of it.
Right. Exactly. Exactly. And I think that that's a good thing to point out. And I'm glad you shared the history of that. That's very interesting. So actually, in some way, Seventh-day Adventists are carrying on a tradition that they get from Anglicans there. A tradition that Anglicans have actually abandoned, but a tradition that they get from Anglicans there. And as somebody who has been both Adventist and Anglican, that's quite fascinating to me.
Yeah,
so
indeed.
but that does bring up something interesting because you know a lot of the things that we talked about before were more positive things, and maybe from an Adventist perspective, I suppose having communion infrequently would be kind of a neutral thing. From our perspective, I think maybe it's not quite as neutral, because from our perspective, there are certain things that happen in communion that you don't get another way. But Adventists believe communion to be more symbolic, so um, I leave that on the table. But
Yeah, I think we've got to
maybe.
bookmark that. Now, I'm pretty sure surely you've done an episode on that before.
Yes. In fact, I had
Yes.
a debate on it. So we'll definitely table that. But what I wanted to say was that, I think that does hit the nail onto the fact that sometimes traditions go deeper than, haystacks and Sabbath school are things that are positive traditions. They're also things that you might say are kind of surface level traditions. They're things that sort of naturally happen and get passed down. But I think there are also some things within Adventist tradition that go a little bit deeper, that are maybe even to the point where Adventist theology itself is affected. And I think that we can see that in some specific areas in particular. The communion 4 times a year thing, I think, kind of dovetails into this because, as you just said, that kind of disproves the notion of no creed but the Bible. And now that we have kind of opened up the door to that, I think we can examine some things that actually affect the theology. So, can you think of anything within Adventism that does affect their theology, that would be part of their tradition?
Yeah, for sure. So here's an example. Within Sabbath school, the prioritization of which topics get discussed is a kind of a deeper level tradition. So we've talked about Sabbath school as an institution, Sabbath school
Hmm.
as a something that passes along tradition, but the actual selection of the topics within Sabbath school. And for those who are not Adventists, you've got to understand that the General Conference in Silver Springs, Maryland, produces an adult lesson study guide that has a lesson per day for every day of the week, and this guide gets distributed to all English-speaking populaces around the world, and I'm guessing they also have translations of it for non-English speaking things. So every Adventist is encouraged to study, every
Hmm.
adult Adventist is encouraged to study the same lesson topic on the same day every day of the week. Now, as each other. Now, someone challenged me and gave me a trivia question, which made me do a little bit of sleuthing. So, what the question he asked me was, how frequently do Adventists teach the Beatitudes? So I went through, wait for it, 20 years of adult Sabbath school lessons. I took a 20-year sampling from about 1990 to about 2010 and counted the number of times there were quotes from Matthew chapter 5. And what I found was there were 3 days in 20 years where quotes were from Matthew chapter 5, and 2 of those references were with respect to Matthew 5:17, which is talking about no jot or tittle shall pass from the law until all is fulfilled. That was quoted twice in 20 years. There was one other incidental reference within the adult Sabbath school lesson, but in the 20-year stretch I looked at, essentially there was 0 teaching on the Beatitudes. Now, if you're an Adventist listening to that, you might go, yes, so what? Well, the so what is, within the Orthodox tradition, the third antiphon that we sing in liturgy consists of the Beatitudes probably about 40 times a year, probably 40 Sundays a year. Kevin
If
and
not
I
more.
will be at liturgy singing the Beatitudes, and it's like the third or fourth thing we do within liturgy, within our worship service. It's repeated so often because the Orthodox tradition presents the Beatitudes as a central teaching of Jesus.
Hmm.
It's not incidental for the Orthodox worldview, for the Orthodox mind, for the Orthodox heart. It is a central teaching of Jesus. And for there to be essentially no teaching of the Beatitudes within the sample period that I looked at, 20 years is enough to represent a solid portion of someone's adult life.
Right.
This is a deep and deeply meaningful selection of what's important within Adventism. And you can compare and contrast it and say, This is deeply different from what happens within Orthodoxy in terms of its prioritization of topics.
Right.
So just throw it to you, Kevin. What do you think the net impact of no teaching about the Beatitudes for a 20-year period would be on the life of a Christian?
Well, I mean, if in my own context, and even just, in various things that I've read, so many stories I've read where somebody is reading the Beatitudes and feels conviction that, man, I'm not living according to this. And it causes them to change their whole behavior. And then, even just in my own context, I've had so many times where maybe I'll be at church and I'll be singing the Beatitudes, and in- maybe as I'm singing it, it occurs to me like, hey, wait a minute, this says that I need to be forgiving my neighbor. This says that I need to, blessed are the peacemaker. I need to be a peacemaker. And here I am, not always being a peacemaker. Here I am, maybe being somebody who likes to kind of stir the pot at work because it's funny or whatever. Well, that's not really funny because Jesus says, "Blessed are the peacemakers, not blessed are those who stir the pot." So then that changes the way when I go back to work on Monday, I'm now going back to work as a very different person than the one who left work on Friday because I've been reminded that I need to be more thoughtful, that I need to be more cognizant of these things. And the if the beatitudes were never set before me, I mean, this is where Christ and God himself tells us what he desires us to do. I can't even imagine how what a hole that would leave in my I as an Orthodox Christian now can't even imagine what a difference it really makes to just not have that essential you know what I mean? It's like
Yeah.
the thought is kind of actually startle. I mean, when you just said that about examining a 20-year period and the beatitudes only came up 3 times, I was actually really taken aback by that. Just sitting here, I was thinking, how is that even possible? Like, the Beatitudes are such an essential thing. I couldn't even. It actually took me a moment after you said that to process that because it was so unfathomable to me that was like I thought I misheard you, to be completely honest.
No, look, well, the reason I did the study was because someone said that it wasn't important to Adventism, and I said they were wrong. I said
Right.
they would prove them wrong. And so I took the 20-year sample because I was going to prove them wrong how often it was taught. And I had to go back with him, had to eat my hat, as it were, and say that he was right. Now, of course, we're not saying that Adventists are not shaped by the Beatitudes.
Right.
We're not saying that Adventists personally don't study and read them and value them. We're not saying that Adventists are not shaped by Jesus' teaching here. What we are saying is that the the tradition of the Seventh-day Adventist Church doesn't select the Beatitudes as something that is, worthy of study within a Sabbath school context.
Right.
And maybe we should talk about, you know, what Sabbath school is like. And so now there's a word, it's a long word, it's called epistemology. It means a way of knowing, how we know things. And I want to talk a little bit about how we know things and the deeper structure of Sabbath school as a way of how we know things. Now, every Adventist knows about William Miller's study technique, that he started at
Right.
Genesis and he read through, and when he didn't know a word, that he would look it up, and he would see how the Bible defined it, and he wasn't happy to go on with it beyond that until he'd found out how the Bible had defined that. He let the Bible define his terms, and that he wanted to know, to understand everything. Now, that is told so often. It actually happens to be Adventist myth. That's not at all how he actually studied the Bible, but it is how Adventists talk about how he studied the Bible. Look, if you disbelieve me on that history, you can go and dig into some history books about William Miller and how he actually studied the Bible. His wife actually got him a subscription to the local library, and he actually went through books of doctrine and theology from other
Interesting.
Protestant writers, and they formed and shaped the way he read the Bible quite a bit. But moving back to the Adventist mythos, which is part of the Adventist tradition, the reason that story is told is to model how you understand the Bible. Now, the really important thing is the way that is modeled, and the way it's modeled within Sabbath school, is that you can understand the Bible with a very simple surface level reading. All you got to do is get the right texts, and you can figure it out.
Right.
That the truth is present. It can be got on a surface level mostly, because that's what the little page to a day thing is. It's only about 2 or 3 paragraphs, so you can only express a few simple ideas each day. And if you've got 2 or 3 Bible texts that you're looking at each day, you can only, think about it at a fairly surface level, and that's the way it's presented for the worldwide audience. And that's how Bible study is modeled for the vast majority of Adventists.
Which I just want to say to that point that, the Bible is not, this presents the Bible itself in such a way as if it presents the Bible very much in the way, and I'm trying to be careful how I say this, because what I actually see there is it presents the Bible in the same way that when I engage with atheists, how they present the Bible, as if the Bible is just this, from an atheist perspective, I guess they would phrase it as the Bible's just kind of this archaic, simple book written by dumb people, and I can just pick it up, open it, and I can understand everything in it because it's all dumb and I'm so much smarter than the people who. And I'm not saying that Adventists do think that, but when you present the Bible in such a way that it's like, well, I can examine 3 texts and only give them a paragraph, and that's sufficient to teach you about the Bible, it's actually presenting it in the exact same way that an atheist presents it, where you would think you come away from that with the impression the Bible writers weren't very smart. They just wrote down these things that are so easy that I can come along and in 3 paragraphs, or in a couple paragraphs, I can explain 3 different Bible verses here. See, the Bible's easy. It's not a very intelligent book. Like that, you see what I mean? It's very problematic the way that it
Yeah.
oversimplifies.
Well, I think what we're talking about is an outgrowth of the idea of the perspicuity of Scripture.
Right.
That the idea is readily available. Now, I don't think, faithful Adventists don't think that Bible writers are dumb, and
Right.
they don't think that they don't sit around thinking that they're smarter than the Bible writers, but they do think that the ideas being discussed are easily obtained from the text.
Right.
Now, just as a comparison, that's quite different actually from how the people within the Bible relate to the scripture that came before them. Just read the Psalms, just read Psalm 119. the writer of the Psalms says over and over and over that he meditates on Torah. He runs the Torah through his mind. He reads the Torah morning, noon, and night. He carries it around with him. He rolls it through his mind. So, within the broader Christian tradition, there's developed a meditative reading of the Bible called Lectio Divina, which comes from a meditative tradition of reading the Bible. Now, this is quite a different idea from the look at 2 or 3 Bible verses and you can compare a few other Bible verses and figure out what the Bible's saying. That's a very different way of relating to what's in the Bible. And some of the Bible writers, the psalmist, had a strong meditative tradition around the Torah. And Christians subsequently have had a strong meditative tradition around the Gospels. Sabbath school as a way of knowing the Bible, that the understanding that the meanings can be gained from a surface level, brute force, looking up thesauruses and understanding scripture, is one way of understanding the Bible. And it's not a wrong way, but it's certainly just a particular way, and we would say that particular way is characteristic of Adventist tradition in terms of knowing the Bible. Adventist epistemology is kind of how we've been characterizing it, and we can distinguish that from other ways of reading and understanding and appreciating scripture within the broader Christian tradition, as exemplified by people within the Bible. Another way, or another factor in understanding scripture, is that the writers of the New Testament present that it's important to be indwelt with the Holy Spirit in order to understand scripture.
Right.
That's something that doesn't have a huge play within the Adventist milieu, the way that Sabbath school is presented and taught, the way William Miller is talked about. I mean, at the time he was doing this amazing Bible study, he was an active member of the Masonic Lodge.
Right.
Something that his Christian culture told him was a bad thing to do, and he was quite unrepentant about it, about being it, and he only actually gave up his Masonic affiliations under pressure from the broader Christian world when he began actually teaching his Jesus is Coming Soon messages. It was about a year after he launched his public campaign, he actually gave up his affiliation because it was getting embarrassing to him.
Right.
So we're saying that the hero of the Adventist faith, William Miller, studied the Bible in a certain way. That way of studying the Bible is a way that Adventists model today. But in some sense, that way of studying the Bible in and of itself is disjunct, if you like, from the meditative, spirit-filled tradition of understanding the Bible that is modeled within the Bible itself.
Exactly. It's also fascinating to me that, this gets at something that Caleb, who's of Caleb's Corner, he and I were talking about this when he was doing the prep work for his lesson on the Septuagint. And one of the things that I had said to him as we were going back and forth was that one thing that I've noticed about not just the Adventist tradition, but even other elements within the Protestant tradition, especially more Reformed, more Puritan elements, is that they take this very intellectual view of the Bible, that the Bible is something that I can understand intellectually. And it's very fascinating because, for example, Dr. James White, he has said on his Dividing Line show that that he's learned things about textual criticism and about the text of the scripture. He's learned things from Bart Ehrman, who's a famous atheist. And I remember when he said that, when I was still reformed, it it sort of didn't sit well with me, but I couldn't quite say why. But now, as I've come to understand what you were just talking about, the Lectio Divina, the idea that spiritual things are spiritually discerned, what I've come to realize was that what he said made me uncomfortable because it didn't make sense to me that someone who is, by his own admission, against what this text teaches, and who, by his own admission, believes that this text is ridiculous and silly and not, Bart Ehrman doesn't even believe that we have the actual words of Jesus. And you're telling me that you listen to this guy who believes this, and that you have gained insight onto the text that he doesn't believe in from listening to him. It made no sense to me, and it still makes no sense to me. But and forgive me, but what you just said kind of turned a key for me here, that you're right, that it's like the the same thing is this claim, like you said, it's actually a myth, but this claim that William Miller, who's a Freemason, is going around and he's got his Bible and he's reading it, and he's able to discern the meaning just by flipping back and forth and seeing. It turns the Bible into something that's purely intellectual and removes from the Bible the actual spiritual nature of it, such that it, in a lot of ways, I unintentionally, I don't think Adventists intend what I'm about to say, but I think unintentionally what it says is that the Bible is really just like any other book. It's not a unique text. It's not something special. It's not something powerful. It's just a book that I can understand by picking it up, opening it, and being smart enough, being intellectual enough, being whatever. And this seems diametrically opposed to how the Bible is looked at within the Bible, like you said, but it also seems diametrically opposed to what the Bible claims to be.
Well, I would I'd take you on a little bit there, challenge you
Okay,
slightly, but
fair enough. Like I
let
said,
me
this
let,
just
let
kind of.
me let me I'll take what you said and let me try to refine it just a little bit.
Okay, I appreciate that.
In my experience, Adventists treat the Bible as a very special book. It contains the words of God, and the way Adventists, carry their Bibles to church, even though the texts are being shown up on the big screen, but they've still got a Bible in their hand, and that's a very powerful symbolic action. That's part of
Right,
the Adventist tradition in taking their Bibles to church, in looking up the text when the preacher refers to the text. And I know a lot of Adventists take the Bible very, very seriously. But what I think you were saying, and what I'll propose as a better way of saying what you're saying,
yeah,
is that despite the Bible being a very special book because it contains the words of God, that Adventists treat it as if it can be apprehended in the same way
Mm.
as any other book.
Yes, that is more what I mean. That
There
is
we
more what I mean. Yes, because I don't mean to imply that Adventists think the Bible is meaningless. What I mean is that they treat it as something trite that that their tradition, I should say, their tradition treats it as if it's something trite that can be understood and apprehended just like anything else.
go. Hmm.
Which is
Okay, so let's get at a couple of things that are actually really central to the Adventist tradition.
okay.
Let's talk for just a little bit about the Great Controversy worldview.
Mhm.
Okay, because the Great Controversy worldview um, is something that's utterly central to the Adventist tradition. Um, so let's just say something about this. So, Ellen White had a vision at some point in time, fairly early in her visionary ministry, and she plays that out in several books in slightly different ways. But within the Great Controversy, within the book called The Great Controversy, she plays out this vision she had where she sees um, Lucifer engaging in a dispute with Christ and saying something like, um, you know, Christ or God, you're unfair. Um, people can't, obey your law. It's impossible. And in Ellen's vision, it's like God says, "Okay, try it. Let's see." And then Lucifer comes back with another stab at it. Um, even if someone keeps your law, they're not going to. Even if someone can keep your law, they're not going to. That type of thing. So this idea that there is a dispute going on between the demonic forces and God, that the universe is sort of waiting with bated breath to see what happens as a result of this controversy. The fact that the controversy is being played out on Earth by humans, and that we are the agents and the test case, that God is actually in the dock, that the courtroom is packed by awaiting angelic onlookers, looking on to see whether God is acquitted of these of these claims that the demonic forces are making against him, and that we humans are the evidence to see whether God is just and true and righteous and merciful. So this is a powerful story that sits at the heart of every Adventist understanding the Bible, reading the Bible, understanding salvation, understanding eschatology, understanding how to live your life today, understanding prophecy. This is a powerful controlling story that sits at the heart of the way every Adventist reads the Bible. So that's my take on the Great Controversy worldview. Kevin, in your experience, how does this Great Controversy worldview, actually affect people's understanding of salvation?
Well, in a lot of ways, what I've seen is that it makes it turns the story of the Bible into a very man-centered story. It's very much a story that becomes about man and people. and it loses, in a lot of ways, Christ becomes very much less the center of the story. Um, it kind of reminds me of, there's sort of a joke, but there's a pastor in my area. I won't say his name, but he's a fairly famous pastor around here. I don't know that he's relevant anywhere else, but he has this method of going through the Bible, and it's become quite comical to people in my area, because he goes through the Bible and basically every story is about you. You're the star of the story. You're David slaying Goliath. Just whatever it is, it's you. And this is kind of a joke, like, oh, there he goes again. And people make little pictures where it says, like, here's this guy reading his Bible, and you see him and he's David, and then he's Daniel, and then he's Daniel in the lion's den, but he's also all the lions. It's like so absurd. But anyway, the point is that this is kind of, within Adventism, it's like all of these things that are supposed to point us to Jesus, and show us how great Jesus is, and how amazing of a savior Jesus is. And all these things are supposed to exalt Christ and reveal Christ, but instead there's this great controversy story that gets read back into everything, and becomes really almost a framework through which everything becomes examined. All of history becomes examined. The scriptures themselves become examined through this. And it just presents this very, frankly, depressing view that is just, it's a very dark place to be, um, because the God that it portrays, a God who can be on trial, a God who can be, um, a God who needs me to vindicate him, and who is just weak and needs Cheryl likes to joke that, like, the Adventist God really needs my help in a lot of things. He needs me to do certain things. He needs me. And this picture of salvation, this picture of the gospel, it's all very dark and depressing and stressful. Um but that's my perception of the great controversy worldview. I think I've gone beyond what you were actually asking, though.
That's all right. That's all right. So that's your evaluation. Now, I totally agree with you that the great controversy worldview provides a framework within which the Bible is read. In fact, that is exactly how Ellen White intended it to be.
Hmm.
She taught that this framework was the key to understanding Scripture. What's really important to know is that this is an act of reading the Bible through a certain governing tradition.
Hmm.
The great controversy worldview as a tradition is it's got the tradition both in terms of how it's passed down as well as a certain type of content, and it provides a key for Adventists to understand who God is, who the devil is, who you are in relation to God and the devil, what your mission in life is, how this affects salvation, and in fact, what the Sabbath has to do with all of that. All of these aspects and more are understood within the Adventist mind with respect to the great controversy worldview, which as a governing dominant worldview, which means the Bible is read through this particular tradition. And that's the definition of a tradition.
Right. That's really fascinating to me. And I can't believe I've never really thought about this in these terms before. And so I apologize that I'm kind of getting excited here, and but it does really fascinate me, because as we kind of started out this talking about, our mutual experience of the fact that the word tradition itself, there's a tradition within Adventism of hating the word tradition. It reminds me of a joke I heard one time, that in the United States, the only tradition is bashing other traditions. Um, and that's kind of a joke about the fact that in this country we really don't like, um, we have a tendency to be very libertarian and don't like anyone telling us what to do, even if that person is objectively right. Like, you totally should do this because you'll you'll harm yourself otherwise. No, I do what I want to do. So we kind of have that joke here, but that's the tradition within Adventism of bashing tradition, and tradition is bad, and we have truth versus tradition. And yet, as you just pointed out, their whole interpretive framework for the scriptures themselves comes from this tradition handed down to them from Ellen G. White. So that's very fascinating that, you have this interesting dichotomy where, on the one hand, there's this very antagonistic stance to tradition, and yet, on the other hand, the entire worldview itself is a tradition, and is a tradition that comes not from the scriptures but from Ellen G. White. And, like I said, I've just never thought about it in those terms, and that's very fascinating. So I'm glad that
Now,
you brought that up.
now, Adventists, of course, would say that there are the seeds for the great controversy idea within Scripture. And they point to Job chapter 1 and some other texts. And I'm not going to evaluate that here, but it is really important to say that, and the Adventist hypothesis is that Scripture ought to be read within the great controversy framework.
Hmm.
Now, in a couple of months, I'm going to be teaching, or either myself or my colleague, Subdeacon Timothy Grace, one of us, will be teaching the hypothesis of truth that was taught by the early Christian church. It's the third series in the Foundations course, and we'll be talking specifically about Saint Irenaeus, and who he was, and what he deduced was the church's hypothesis of truth. I'll give you a hint. It wasn't the great controversy worldview, but in that session, we will be teaching what Saint Irenaeus deduced was the hypothesis of truth, and something that is absolutely central to understanding the Bible, and exactly why that particular tradition was selected as the way to read the Bible. So if you're at all interested, tune in a couple of months to the Foundations course that we run here at the Good Shepherd Orthodox Church in Clayton, Victoria, and we'll walk you through that tradition. And if you've got an Adventist mindset, you can compare it. You can compare it to the great controversy worldview and find its similarities and differences,
Hmm.
and have a think about doing a comparison. Now there is so much we can talk about. I'd love to talk with you about something that came out of Jack Hone's book that we talked about earlier,
Mhm.
Adventist Tomorrow, he outlines an Adventist view of Christology, a particular teaching of an Adventist view of Christology. But this is so much of a deeper topic. We would have to have a completely separate session if we were going to talk about this, Kevin. But if you're up for it at some stage, wouldn't mind having a session like this and just talking about Christology and how Adventist Christology is so interlinked and interwoven through its theology and its teaching of salvation, and how
Mhm.
interlinked everything is within the Adventist tradition. Just picking up by one little thread of an Adventist understanding of Christ and how that has been formed by the Adventist tradition more broadly.
Yeah, I would love to do that session. I would love to do that session. Well, why don't you tease it a little bit here by sharing what he said that sparked
Well,
this?
yeah, cool. So the one little thing that he said is that Adventists understand
Excuse me.
that when Christ became incarnate, when he put on human flesh, that he gave up his omniscience, his
Oh yeah.
his his omnipresence, and that he has forever given up his omnipresence.
Hmm.
Now, this actually is a radically different teaching
Right.
from the the broader Christian view of Christ. I don't know how many Protestant uh, churches or Protestant traditions that this would be consistent with, but the historic church did not understand Christ to have forever given up omnipresence as a property. And this has deep implications
Mhm.
for core theology that is worth teasing out.
Indeed. Indeed. So now we have to do that other session because I'm because I'm really interested. Now, before I know we're probably getting close to time to
We
wrap
are,
up here,
yeah.
but before we do you mind if we tackle one more audience question and then kind of wrap up?
Awesome.
So, Rafael Rodriguez, who is a fellow former Adventist, he asks, what do you make of the SDA axiom that truth is progressive? It seems like a way to justify why it took 1850 years for God's quote unquote remnant church to be restored as a visible and dogmatic authority. So the reason why I wanted to tackle this here is because I think that dovetails in pretty well with what you were just talking about, that the Adventist interpretive framework is so thoroughly um comes from their own tradition. And I think that this idea of truth being progressive, I guess the first thing I would have to say is that's actually not a uniquely Adventist position. That position actually, um, as much as Adventists would be loath to hear this, that position actually comes out of early German theological liberalism from the 1700s.
Them's fighting
And
words, man. They are fighting words.
But yeah, Adventists would not like to hear that, but that is where this idea of truth being progressive, where so the basic premise is of this view that really springs out of this left leaning camp, what will eventually become liberalism as we get into the 19th century. Um, it'll become liberalism, but it starts there in the 18th century, the 1700s. But basically, the idea is that you have in ancient times, you have this sort of evolution of religion. So religion starts out as the worship of many gods, and then people whittle it down, so they realize that these many gods, according to the thesis, don't actually exist, and then they realize that they just worship one god. And basically, the thesis is presented as this sort of domino that eventually what you get is um, 18th or 19th century German liberal Protestantism. Um, and so that's what they mean when they say truth is progressive. Well, Adventists picked up this narrative, but for them, the truth that was progressive was ultimately Adventism itself. And so Adventism is the culmination of the evolution of religion. So it's not a uniquely Adventist position. Unfortunately, it's actually the way that a lot of different um, Protestant evangelical churches present the the history of the world. But the reality is actually quite different than that. And Father Stephen DeYoung and Andrew Stephen Damick have been doing a better job than I could here at discussing what we actually see in history. They have a podcast called Lord of Spirits that I would highly recommend if you're interested in that. And I usually have it somewhere close to me, but Father Stephen DeYoung in particular has a book called The Religion of the Apostles, and he has a more focused perception there. But what he shows is that, as a matter of fact, the core Christian teachings and the core Orthodox teachings were not things that had to develop over time. They were things that were actually present even within the text of the Old Testament. And then, what if it develops at all, what you actually see is the New Testament clarifying the debates that were going on in the time. So, for example, in the time of Second Temple Judaism, there was a debate about, there wasn't a debate about whether there was a second person of the Godhead in the Old Testament. That was an established fact. The debate was who this second person was. And so in the New Testament, what we see is not John saying, in the beginning there was the Word, and the Word was with God. He's not saying that as like, you don't know this, but check this out. What he's saying is actually something that he's playing off of the idea that, so we all know that in the beginning there was the Word, and the Word was with God. But now I'm going to tell you who that Word is. That Word turns out to be Jesus Christ, who actually dwelt among us. So that's not an example of truth being progressive and doctrine developing. It's an example of Christianity preserving and perhaps clarifying something that was already present in what had gone before in the Old Testament itself. So what I would say is, as far as truth is progressive, I can't blame Adventists for that. I don't think that Adventists came up with it as a way to justify a problem within Adventism. What more so happened was that the cultural milieu of the United States at that time was one that was flirting with this liberalizing tendency to say that truth was an evolving notion. And we can see today how well that works out, because for the people who believed this, their cultural descendants have now evolved past an understanding of what gender they are. So that's, it clearly, truth being progressive is not a worldview that actually has borne good fruit. But even when it was being presented, it didn't make a whole lot of sense. And archaeological studies themselves have largely made, within the scholarly community, um, the discipline of archaeology has largely made this idea irrelevant, because what we've discovered is that a lot of the earliest cities established were actually established not based on natural resources as you would suspect, but were actually based on ritual significance. And that only makes sense if people were having religious experiences that defined their civilizations, and then cities and civilizations were built around these religious centers, which is the exact opposite of what the um, truth is progressive, evolutionary truth hypothesis was claiming. And so realistically, within the community of scholarship, new arguments are being leveled against Christianity, but those old arguments have been pushed aside. And so Adventism, talking about truth being progressive, that's a tradition that they've passed on from their own forefathers, that they themselves had inherited from just a different context. But it's not something that really reflects reality. And hopefully within a certain amount of time, even Adventists will stop saying this idea that truth is progressive, because we'll all have just recognized that it makes absolutely no sense. But anyway, so I don't know if you have anything to add to that, Loryn.
Yeah, I do. The idea that more truths are yet to be revealed is something that Ellen White said over and over, and it's
Hmm.
why the General Conference continues to meet every 5 years in session and refine the 28 fundamental beliefs. Most of my life, it was 27 fundamental beliefs. I'm actually not sure when it was, but an extra fundamental belief was added. At some point in the last 20 years. In the last General Conference session, the fundamental belief around creation was refined to specify that day in Genesis 1 means a 24-hour period, a solar day, and so forth. That wasn't part of the the actual formulated doctrine of the church. I mean, it was consistently taught, but it wasn't actually officially part of the formulated 27 or 28 fundamental beliefs throughout most of my life, and it was just adopted in like 2016 or something, 2015, 2016, somewhere
Wow.
around there. So Adventists do teach that truth is progressive insofar as saying that God is unveiling more truth to Adventists. However, the most typical phrasing of the comment within Adventism is not that truth is progressive, but that testing truth is progressive. Now, this is a slightly different topic. What Adventists mean by testing truth is that at various times God has had a testing truth that has divided the people of God who are for him from the people of God who reject him and are against him. So they look back at Noah's Ark and they say the people who got on board Noah's Ark were the people who embraced God's truth. The door of the ark closing was a testing truth. The teaching that there would be rain was a testing truth which divided the believers from the non-believers, and the non-believers perished. A testing truth in the first century was that Christ is the Messiah, that Jesus Christ is the second power in heaven, and that he is the promised Messiah, and that if you accepted him, you were part of the people of God from then onwards, and that people who rejected him were not part of the people of God any longer, that Christ himself became a testing truth. Adventists say that within the Protestant Reformation, accepting the Protestant Reformation became a testing truth, and people who remained Catholics were cut off from that truth. And then again, with the first, second, and third angels' messages being promulgated by the Adventist movement, they said that the acceptance of Sabbath, the first angel's message, and I'm using very Adventist terms here and Adventist jargon, I won't actually unpack this any further, but they say that this was a testing truth, that the acceptance of Sabbath was a testing truth from about the mid-1850s onwards. So the idea that there is a testing truth that is progressive is the idea that's most common and most typical of Adventist doctrine and eschatology. And to the questioner's question as to whether they adopt that to excuse the fact that they showed up, in the mid-19th century rather than having a tradition earlier than that. Let me say, actually, I don't know. I'd have to think about it more. But what I will say is that the Adventist mythos, that the Adventist tradition that stems from Ellen White, seems to suggest that Christianity was so corrupt at the time of the mid-19th century that it needed to be completely refounded. If you read through Ellen's apologia for the failure of the Millerite date setting, she creates an analogy between the disciples misunderstanding Christ and the Advent movement misunderstanding the prophecy, and that the resurrection showed the disciples what the truth was, and so some further prophecy shows Adventism what the truth was, and that sense that Christianity was completely refounded is kind of wrapped up in the way that Adventists reject all previous creeds, that they reject all the teachings of churches before, and that they argue that they needed to refound and rediscover everything based on their own Bible study, even if they eventually came to the same conclusions or similar conclusions to the broader Christian church. They needed to restudy it for themselves because it hadn't properly been studied before. And so it's not actually stated, in my experience, it's not actually stated anywhere like this, but my assessment of it is based on that apologia where Ellen White does create this analogy between Christ's disciples' disappointment at his death and the Adventist disappointment at the failure of Christ to reappear in 1844, there is a subtle sense that all of Christianity needed to be refounded within Adventism, that there was a rebirth of Christianity entirely, and that all Christian churches other than Adventists have fallen because they rejected the Sabbath teaching, and that only Adventism is Christianity, is a true church, because it passed the testing truth of that time. I think that's something that's quite coherent within, and I think that's a coherent synthesis of what the Adventist tradition is surrounding that. Would you agree there?
Yeah, yeah, I think that, as you were, it's kind of funny because when he asked that question, I kind of put in the chat, thank you for asking that question. I actually had planned eventually to do a whole video on that topic, but I appreciate you bringing it up here. But you just basically said what I probably would have said anyway. So, I mean, I think you
Oh,
just
well, don't
covered it
don't let me
perfectly.
stop you from
No,
doing a good session.
no, I think you covered it really well there, that you're right, and I appreciate that clarification that the Adventist perspective on this isn't exactly that truth itself is progressively changing, but rather that the testing truth is this progressive thing, and that it changes with the times because there's different things that they would see as the test of what makes a person a Christian or not.
Yeah, so
Um,
in the Adventist mindset, Sabbath observance has always been true throughout history, from creation through to today, and it's always been something that's binding on every individual on earth, but only when Adventists began to proclaim it as the first angel's message in the mid 1850s did it become a testing truth that scythed through the Christian world and separated entire churches from the true church, from the churches that are fallen.
right. And in that sense, I think um, Adventism ultimately is a restorationist movement. And so, just like any other restorationist movement, they I think all restorationist movements have some degree of this idea that there's a testing truth for our day, and we're the ones carrying the banner. Everybody else stinks, and so Adventism isn't unique in that, but where Adventism is unique is that they place that testing truth as being their particular view of the Saturday Sabbath and that sort of thing.
Well, there you go.
So
That's something I didn't know. I didn't know it was common within other restorationist movements.
yeah, I
Perhaps
mean,
that's something we got to something you got to teach me about a little bit more, because I didn't know that.
oh
That's
yeah, it's
yeah.
I mean restorationism, it's it's a
Maybe
fascinating
maybe we
rabbit hole.
bookmark that, mate, because we.
Yeah, because we have been going for 2 hours. So
Hey, but does
um
this bring us round to the Sabbath thing?
yeah,
Links into our next session. How about you give us the wrap and tease us on the next session we're about to do?
sure. So our next session is going to be on upgrading which this is what we've been working towards. This was actually, for context, what I had pitched to Lauren initially was that we would do a show together on upgrading the Sabbath Sunday debate. And then, as he was preparing what he wanted to say for that, he kind of approached me and said that, as it turns out, there was some groundwork that he wanted to lay with that. And because I love working with Loryn so much, I jumped on the opportunity to do not just one, but three now different things together. So I'm really grateful to Loryn for joining me on this. And next week, we're going, which will be, I believe for me, it's January 30th. For you, it's actually going to be February 1st. And for me, it's 8 p.m. For you, it's 3
8
p.m.
Yeah.
Just like basically exactly when this started. But next week, we're going to be doing
Fortnight,
upgrading the Sabbath Sunday
fortnight
debate.
from now.
Oh,
Fortnight from
yeah, sorry, yeah, 2 weeks from now. Um, Next week I'm going to be doing something else. So maybe next week it'll be on restorationism. No, but
now.
yeah, so in 2 weeks we're doing the upgrading the Sabbath Sunday debate, where we're going to use this as the foundation. So we've just talked about how tradition is something that everyone has a tradition, and we've talked about kind of how tradition works and that sort of thing. And now that's actually going to play into how Adventists view the Sunday Sabbath issue, and how versus how the rest of Christianity does. And Loryn and I are going to attempt to actually upgrade the Sabbath Sunday debate and take ourselves into sort of an orthodox understanding of that debate. So I really look forward to doing that in 2 weeks with Loryn, and we will see you then, and I will see you next week as well. So see you, and thank you for watching, and God bless.